Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And this week I'm joined by Nicholas Morton, who has written The Mongol Storm, which is, of course, the book I'm holding up here. And he was trying to sign the book when he sent it to me, and I really appreciate the book. It was a fantastic read, and this is, of course, the topic for today's episode. And before we begin, I want to ask what were the inspiration behind the book, because it takes a lot of, the book is about the Middle East and the impact, and it's quite heavy impact that the Mongols had on the Middle East, that we will see in a second. But what were the inspiration behind writing how? Because I don't think there has been any book about this topic, at least for some time that I could find. So, what were the inspiration behind the book?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. But what I wanted to do with this book really is I was aware that people had written about the Middle East in the 13th century from the Byzantine perspective, or from the Ayubids perspective, that's Saladin's dynasty, or they'd written about it from the Mongol perspective, or from the Crusader perspective. But I actually felt that this was an era when the best way to understand it is to put those narratives together, to try and understand how all the different societies involved in the Middle East at this time, how they came together, whether through war or through trade or through the exchange of ideas and stories or even recipes. Where did this all come from, and how did they interact, and how did those interactions, those meetings between these different societies, cause history to unfold in the way it did? Because the 13th century is an absolutely pivotal time. So much is changing. The societies that are on the map at the start of the period are nearly always not on the map at the end. There's a sweeping change to the Middle East. And within that process, so many things appear and develop. The magnetic compass, gunpowder, they cross out of China and reach the Mediterranean. There's advances in shipbuilding and ship design, military tactics, ideas, stories. It's an incredibly dynamic time, and it's what makes it so interesting for me is that it's an incredibly brutal time, and it's a fascinating time. And there's friendships, and there's hatreds, and there's wars, and there's rivalries, and there's diplomacy, and it's all taking place in a very small space.
It's
And
really
so
it's
what I
an
want,
epic century, isn't it?
yeah, absolutely. So what I wanted to do with Mongol Storm is to somehow capture all those things and to try and show how the many different societies involved played their part in shaping events.
And you absolutely nailed it. So let's begin because, like you said, in a very short time, from even from this dawn of the 13th century, would change quite drastically. So let's begin because the Middle East will obviously be the focus here. So let's begin to talk a little bit about the map of of what the world looked like at the dawn in the Middle East of the 13th century.
Okay, so there's a lot of things that have been going on around this time, and there's various processes to make sense of. So, in 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 terms of what the world was like in about 1200, in order to understand that, you've got to go back a previous century and a bit, I'm afraid,
Mm.
because in the 11th century, so that's between sort of 1000 and 1100, there was a massive invasion slash migration into the Middle East by the Seljuk Turks and various other Turkish or Turkmen groups who then conquered much of the Middle East. And that includes Persia, Iraq, Syria, much of the Byzantine Empire, what is now Turkey. And that conquest changed the nature of the Middle East, its political composition. And by the time we get to the start of the 13th century, many of the Turkish dynasties from that initial conquest, they're now in power. The Seljuk Empire itself has collapsed, but the area is now ruled by various Turkish dynasties who were sort of the successor states to the Seljuk Empire. And so in Mosul, we have the Zengid dynasty. And in modern day Turkey, or Anatolia as it was then, you've got the Anatolian Seljuks. In much of the Caucasus, there's various Turkish dynasties. And in Egypt and much of Syria, it's ruled by the Ayubids dynasty, that's Saladin's family. Now, Saladin's family is not Turkish, it's Kurdish, but nonetheless, Saladin's family is very much aligned, or it was aligned, with the major Turkish rulers of this era. So much of the map has been shaped by this earlier Turkish invasion before the Mongols even arrived. Then, along the coastline, you've got the Crusader states. And they were founded between 1095 and 1099 by the armies of the First Crusade. And there were 4 Crusader states initially: the County of Edessa in the far north, then Principality of Antioch, County of Tripoli, and the largest one, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They're sort of clinging to the coastline of the Eastern Mediterranean. But by the time that we get to the year 1200, they're much reduced, following Saladin's big victories over the Crusader states between 1187 and 1189, which were involved his reconquest of Jerusalem and his major victory at the Battle of Hattin. Then, elsewhere on the map, you've got the Kingdom of Georgia and Greater Armenia in the Caucasus. And the Caucasus is that area of land between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. And then in the western tip of Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey, you've got the Byzantine Empire. Although 4 years after this, so we're talking about the year 1200, but in 1204, the Byzantine Empire is overthrown by the armies of the Fourth Crusade, which fragment the empire, and it takes a long time for the Byzantine Empire to rebuild itself, and it only ever does that in a partial way. So very broadly, those are sort of the key players on the map, as it were.
Of course, before this as well, before the Fourth Crusade, as it's known, as you mentioned, and the creation of the many Byzantine empires, there you also had the Egyptian campaign on top of that, of course, which also helped shape, almost changed, because it was. So let's talk a little bit about this. I think it's called the Fifth Crusade, if I'm not mistaken. So let's talk about the campaign under Louis IX as well, and why did it go for Egypt? There was a strategic reason behind why they went into Egypt, and I believe that was almost a success, but they, of course, would fail, as we shall see. So if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about the Egyptian campaign, if you wouldn't mind.
Hi, sorry, we had a brief.
I noticed that. Yeah, sorry about that. It's if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about the Egyptian campaign, because of course that would help shape the century as well.
Absolutely. So, yeah, for the Crusaders, in 1187, as I mentioned, Saladin defeated the major field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and then later that year, Saladin conquered Jerusalem. And for contemporaries in Western Christendom, Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem provoked an enormous reaction. The Pope is said to have died from the shock. And in the later years, army after army after army marched into the Middle East with just one simple goal: to retake Jerusalem. And so there was a massive crusade called the Third Crusade, led by people like Frederick I of Germany, or Philip II of France, and Richard I of England. And it enabled the Crusader states to recover a bit, but they didn't take Jerusalem. And then the Fourth Crusade, it was supposed to attack Egypt, but in fact it went and attacked Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, instead. What we're witnessing with the Fourth Crusade, which is then carried on into later crusades, including the Fifth Crusade, which is where I start my book, and then later on with Louis IX's crusade, is a focus on Egypt as a goal for crusading. And the reason they're doing that is because Egypt is economically by far the most powerful territory in the entire area. It's got the trans-Saharan gold routes running through it, the spice routes from the Indian Ocean, and one leg of the Silk Roads out of Central Asia. It's got the agricultural wealth of the Nile Delta, and a fairly advanced taxation system. So Egypt is valuable. And what the Crusaders are trying to achieve here is the thinking that if they can take Egypt, then the conquest of Egypt and the possession of Egypt's revenues will enable them to conquer Jerusalem then permanently. What they don't want is to conquer Jerusalem by itself and then to find that they don't have the resources to garrison it permanently and ensure that they can hold on to it in the long term. So Egypt is a long-term strategy. Conquer Egypt, and then Jerusalem will follow.
Mm.
And so the Fourth Crusade was supposed to attack Egypt, but it didn't. The Fifth Crusade did attack Egypt, but then it failed. And then later on, I think it's in sort of chapter 6 or 7 or something like that of the book, I talk about how Louis IX in late 1240s, early 1250s, again tried and failed to conquer Egypt. But this too, it's a major policy goal for the Crusaders at this time.
Now we have to, of course, as well talk a little bit about the rise of the Mongols as well, and talk about how they were able to do such a rapid expansion and eventually conquer the almost entire Middle East, as well as most but not parts of Eastern Europe. But now we won't focus on the Eastern European part, but we will focus again on the Middle Eastern part here. So let's talk a little bit about the rise of the Mongols as well.
Yeah, so while the Fifth Crusade is going on in Egypt, reports start to come from the east, which are basically making the point that something big is happening. They're not sure what. And ultimately, what it proves to be is the advancing armies of the Mongol Empire. And the background to this is that in the late 12th century, sort of the 1180s, 1190s, there is a leader in what would be today Mongolia called Chinggis Khan. He's more commonly referred to as Genghis Khan today. And he set about a series of wars aimed at unifying and acquiring control over the various nomadic peoples and to some extent the forest belt peoples of Mongolia and then later on Central Asia. After that, he invaded China. After that, he invaded into the regions around the edge of China until eventually, in 1218, he began his expansion into the Middle East. And that expansion happened at a very dramatic moment because in 1218, a group of Mongol merchants reached the border town of Utra in modern-day Uzbekistan. And they purportedly just wanted to trade their various goods and then return home. But the garrison commander in Utra arrested all the Mongol merchants and then sent word to his ruler. And his ruler was the Sultan in charge of the Khwarezmian Empire, which is a Persian empire. And he said, what do I do with all these Mongol merchants who I've arrested? And the Sultan said, well, you kill them all. And so he did.
And we should add as well that in Mongol customs, killing the envoys was a big no, and that was pretty much a declaration of war, and that was the biggest sin that they could commit in Mongol society.
Absolutely. I mean, no society likes their envoys being killed, but the Mongols took particular exception to it. Yeah, absolutely. So when the garrison commander called Inalchuk in Utra killed all these merchants, his orders were to kill all of them, but in fact, one escaped. And the merchant to escape survived to return to Chinggis Khan and tell him what had happened. 2 or 3 months later, a massive Mongol invasion army arrives outside the city. The city is conquered, and Inalchuk is executed by having molten metal poured down his throat. After this, the Mongols then began to expand towards Persia, and this is the origins of the Mongols' invasions into the Middle East. Now, one of the Mongol objectives was to hunt down and capture the Sultan of the Khwarezmian Empire. And to that end, about 20,000 cavalry were sent out to look for him, and they followed the bank or the coastal strip of the Caspian Sea, all the way round, passing through northern Persia, the Caucasus, and eventually into southern Russia. They never found him. But this is really the first introduction to the Middle Eastern powers of the advancing Mongols. And it becomes very clear very quickly that they are a major and very serious force to contend with. Mongol armies were exceptionally dangerous. Firstly, because the Mongols, being steppe nomads, they raised their children to ride, to shoot, to hunt from a very early age. And all of those skills have military applications. And they're fighting against farming societies, and farmers that don't have skills that translate quite so well onto the battlefield. So, thousands of Mongol mounted archers, very mobile on their horses, and they use massed archery tactics, so firing thousands of arrows very accurately at their enemy. It's very hard to compete with that. But Chinggis Khan went one stage further.
Whenever last got nothing.
Sure, yeah. When the Mongols conquered areas such as China, for example, they kept learning. So if they saw a tactic or a weapon or a strategy that they wanted to use, they used it themselves. And so the Mongols began to use Chinese siege engineers because they weren't so effective at siege warfare. But now with the siege engineers, they are effective at siege warfare. And so they're constantly learning. And if they like a society that they've overthrown, what they will do is they will then enroll all the warriors from that society into their army. They won't do it by choice. They will announce, you are now Mongol soldiers. And as Mongol soldiers, you have to fight, live, dress, eat, cut your hair like a Mongol soldier. And if you don't like it, if you don't want to be a Mongol soldier, well, really you have no choice. And the reason that they could force people to do this is that the Mongol army was organized in what's called the decimal system. So a squad of 10 soldiers, 10 squads of 10 soldiers in a group of 100, 10 groups of 100 in a battalion of 1,000, and so on and so forth. But if you desert, if you leave the Mongol army, then the other 9 members of your squad will be executed. And if your entire squad deserts the Mongol army of 10, then the 100 of your company will be executed. So basically you have to fight for the Mongols, whether you would like to or whether you would not like to.
No, there is I know you're not right about this a little bit later, but with the coming of the Mongols, there was a Christian belief that and I'm sure you know what I'm already talking about here, is that and it sounds rather silly coming from a modern perspective, that there was a Christian city with a million, maybe 1,000,000 citizens in Far East. That there was a Christian city there, and the ruler was Prester John, and I have no idea where this originated from, but let's talk a little bit about the idea that the Mongols, and this would kind of affect the century as well, the idea that the Mongols were this Prester John, this mythical figure from the Far East. So let's talk a little bit about the idea behind this and how it's how they began to think that the Mongols were this Christian rule, and of course they would learn quite quickly, I think, that this was not the case, that Mongols were just Prester John. But let's talk a little bit about where the idea came from and why they thought the Mongols would be this Christian ruler.
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to the Fifth Crusaders in Egypt, while their crusade is underway, they hear reports of the Mongols advancing, and exactly as you say, they interpret these reports as meaning that there is an army marching into the Middle East, and they think this army is the army of Prester John. Now, Prester John is a myth that goes back to the 1120s, when a traveller from the east, so the story goes, reached the papal court announcing that there was this empire somewhere out to the east, ruled by an emperor called Prester John. And after that sort of origin story, the idea of Prester John became enormously elaborated in later years. And so eventually Prester John became, in mythology, the emperor of an empire of monsters, ruling over a massive and fabulously wealthy empire. The fountain of eternal youth lay on an island just off the shore, and in the mountains of his kingdom there are dragon masters who rule and ride dragons. Now, this was taken very seriously.
It sounds very plausible.
Well, what I find interesting is that many of the stories about Prester John are still stories that we have Hollywood movies about today. But yeah, it was taken very seriously. And I think that the easiest way to sort of understand it is to think a little bit about some of the science fiction films that we can watch today about planets filled with alien life and strange landscapes and things like that. And the reason I'm offering that comparison is because I'm talking about the unknown. At the time in Western Europe, they didn't know what was out in Asia. They had no idea. And so their imagination coloured in the spaces that they didn't know about and created fantasies in the same way that we don't know what's on other planets. And so again, our own fantasies fill those spaces. Now, of course, there was no such person as Prester John. His empire didn't exist. But the rumours of the advancing Mongols made the Crusaders in Egypt feel that the Mongols were in fact Prester John, and Prester John was marching to help them. And they actually delayed their Crusades' advance for almost a year, precisely because they thought Prester John was going to march and help them, although, of course, that never actually happened. So it's interesting how rumours can have such a serious effect on the real development of events. Soon afterwards, it became clear.
But if I may, didn't some Christian rulers actually align with the Mongols because they thought they were this Prester John figure, that they actually kind of bended the knee to the Mongols because of their belief that this was Prester John?
The Mongols were very effective in the way they conquered different areas. And so not only were their troops very effective and very experienced, and they were accustomed to victory, but they used various strategies and ruses to try and achieve victory. And so when the Mongols reached the Caucasus at around this time, there are stories about them advancing into Christian territory with Christian crosses above their armies, giving the impression that they were a friendly Christian army. And then when their armies came within very close distance of the Christian territory they were advancing into, down go the crosses and the Mongols charge. Now, the Mongols weren't pretending to be Prester John, or we don't have information that they were, but they could certainly pretend to be something they weren't in order to gain the advantage.
Now, as you do, I want to talk a little bit about the Islamic states as well. I want to begin with the Ayubid dynasty because they had quite a decent run, at least while they lasted until the Mamluks take over, as we'll talk about later, of course. So let's talk a little bit about the Ayubid state for a second as well.
Okay, so again, we have to go back a little while, but in the late 12th century, there was, as is well known, a very, very able leader called Saladin from a Kurdish family, and in service to the region's Turkish ruler, he and his uncle conquered Egypt, and then soon afterwards, Saladin then conquered his former master's empire after his former master's death, which then became his own empire, and that empire encompassed Egypt, Syria, and the Jazeera. And the Jazeera is the area of land between the Euphrates River and the Tigris River. It means island, which is notionally between those two rivers. And that became the Ayubid Empire. And the reason it's called the Ayubid Empire is because Saladin's father was called Ayub. And so in respect to his father, it became the Ayubid Empire. Now, Saladin died shortly after the Third Crusade in the 1190s. And immediately after his death, his empire fragmented. And it fragmented between his brother, Al-Adil, and his sons. And they each took one major city or region each, and very soon began to wage war against each other. And so when we talk about the Ayubid Empire, it's not as simple as just being one empire with one ruler.
Mm.
It's actually a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle of different areas, all ruled by different members of the Ayubid family.
So it was more in the sense of principality in a way.
Yeah, it's a sort of collection of principalities, although one member of the Ayubid family does take the title of Sultan of Egypt. But yeah.
Hmm. Did they pay homage to the Sultan of Egypt? So that he was, like you said, he was the Sultan. He was either overlord, and the armies were they kind of one army that they found from the 7 different principalities, or how did army and how did tribute work, if there was such a thing in the Ayubid Empire?
Sure. So, yeah, the Ayubid Sultan was, in theory at least, the ruler of it all. In practice, the other areas acted very independently, and they each had their separate armies. So they didn't act in concert very much. But every now and again, when threatened by an external enemy, like a major crusade, the Ayubids did prove very capable of joining together. And so during the Fifth Crusade, so this is the years 1217 to 1221, the Ayubids did work very closely together to resist the crusade. And then as soon as the crusade went, they started fighting each other again. So it's a slightly complicated form of empire.
Let's talk a little bit of the recruitment of slave soldiers, as I mentioned, the Mamluks, which of course will become important later, because the Ayubid used like slave soldiers and recruited from slave markets of Baghdad and others slave markets who was trained as soldiers to fight for them, and who they, in theory at least, should be absolute loyal to the Sultan. Of course, this would really become a practice until the Ottoman Empire when they successfully integrate this practice. But it would, of course, not be so successful later on in the Ayubids, because like we know, the Mamluk would revolt as their own empire and take over from the Ayubids. But let's talk a little bit about the idea of the Mamluk soldier.
Okay, so it's long been a practice before the Ayubids whereby rulers will purchase enslaved people who will then be trained as soldiers and will then form elite regiments in their armies. And by this period, those soldiers are called Mamluks. And traditionally, the Ayubids bought these enslaved people from a range of different enslaved people markets across the Middle East. But actually, it's possible to buy larger and larger numbers of enslaved people as the 13th century progresses. And the reason for that is that as the Mongol Empire conquers much of what today would be Western Russia or Eastern Europe, it conquers huge areas of land to the north of the Black Sea region and then sells many of the people it's conquered in the slave markets of the northern coast of the Black Sea or the Crimea. And the Ayubids then purchased them from merchants in very large numbers. So the Mongol conquests facilitate the purchase of very large numbers of enslaved people. Many of them are then brought to Egypt and then form bigger and bigger regiments in the Ayubid Egyptian army. But there's a problem with this, which I suspect you're going to come on to in a minute, which is that if you have 100 Mamluk warriors, you can probably control them. If you have 1,000 Mamluk warriors, you can probably control them. What if you've got a lot more than that? And at what point do they realize that their numbers and skills as warriors give them a lot of political power?
Now it's interesting because I feel like I have to compare this to the Janissary system. It's interesting how the Janissaries, they were equally, if not more, numbers than the Ottoman Mamluks. So it's interesting how the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire managed to actually successfully integrate these Janissaries, whereas the Mamluks would grow restless and eventually rebel, as we will talk about as well. So it's interesting how like I said, the Ottomans actually successfully integrated this system into their army, whereas the Ayubids failed and the Ottomans succeeded.
The Ottomans could deploy absolutely huge armies, and so the Janissaries were very powerful, but they only formed one small part of the overall army. But in the Ayubid army, the proportion of Mamluks got very large. And so if you're happy for me to sort of move the narrative forward a bit, the Fifth Crusade fails in 1221 and the Crusaders return home. Or I should say it's a great success for the Ayubids. But then in 1248, there is another major crusade, same target, trying to conquer Egypt. And during this crusade, the crusade again, it fails, although it comes fairly close to success. But in the crusade, the Sultan of Egypt, called Sultan Ayub, dies. He's got a long-standing illness, and he dies of that illness while the crusade is advancing. And his wife, Shaja al-Dur, manages to hold the army together, along with various other lieutenants, for long enough to defeat the Crusaders. And while she does that, she calls on Sultan Ayub's son, called Turan Shah, to come and take power as the next Sultan of Egypt. But in that process, the Mamluk regiments in Egypt play a significant role in defeating the Crusaders, and they want recognition for that. And then when Turan Shah becomes the next Sultan and begins to start acting quite sort of in an authoritarian way towards the Mamluk regiments, the Mamluks don't want that. And so the Mamluks murder the Sultan, Turan Shah, in 1250. And then they take power for themselves. And so you have the situation where you have enslaved people becoming rulers of Egypt. And initially they rule through very young members of the Ayubid family, using them as a sort of puppet ruler for their authority. But then soon afterwards, they declare themselves fully as an empire in its own right. And this is the origin of the Mamluk Empire, which will be a major force in world history until its overthrow in 1516, I think it is, by the Ottoman Empire.
We will come back to Mamluks, of course, in a few minutes. But
Sure.
Another player that you mentioned, of course, is the Seljuk Sultanate, and they will have quite a, I wouldn't say good relation with the Mongols when they come, but they have a decent, a diplomatic relation and play a part with the Mongols when they conquer and later become the Ilkhanate, for sure, of course, as well. If we have time, we'll talk about as well later on. So let's talk a little bit about the Seljuk Turks and their empire as well, and how they would play their relationship to the Mongols when they would come onto the sea.
Sure. So the Seljuk Sultanate is Turkish-ruled sultanate. Turkish families form the ruling elite, but over a very much more mixed population, including many former Greek Christians or Orthodox Christians of the Byzantine Empire. But initially, when the Mongols start to advance into the Middle East, the Seljuks try to strike up diplomacy with the Mongols, and for a time it seems as if the Seljuks paid tribute to the Mongols. But something went wrong, and we're not quite sure what, because in 1242 the Mongols stage a full-scale invasion of the Seljuk Sultanate, and they besiege and conquer the major city of Erzurum. Following year, the Seljuk Sultan raises the largest army he can and marches out to fight the Mongols, and the Mongols, for their part, under a commander called Baichu, advance into the eastern districts of the Seljuk Sultanate. There's a big battle at a place called Koze Dag, in which the Seljuk Sultan is defeated, and the Mongols then advance and force the Seljuk Sultanate to become a Mongol client state. So the Seljuk Sultan can remain in authority, but as a client state to the Mongols. And so that too, it's a major sort of turning point in the Mongol conquests of the Middle East. The subjugation of such an important and powerful territory is a big landmark moment for the Mongol conquest of the area.
No, of course, that's the last part I want to talk about, and this is the last and kind of irrelevant state at this time is, of course, the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate, and though they did wield some power in, it was more of a constitutional sense that because the Abbasids were still caliph in all, though they didn't have much power as they once had, because they were the pillar of the Islamic world for early only in the 9th to 11th century, but by the 12th and 13th century they would become less irrelevant power. So then, of course, we have to talk about the fall last. We made an episode on the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate quite a while ago, but let's talk a little bit about the last days and last lifespan of the Abbasid Caliphate up until 1258, because it was quite a devastating siege as well when the Mongols came to invade the Abbasid Caliphate.
Yes, indeed. So the Mongol invasions into the Middle East take place in waves. The first wave took place in 1220 to 1221, and that's where the Mongols went around the circumference of the Caspian Sea. Then there's a 10-year gap, and in 1230, a new wave of Mongol invasions conquered the remainder of Persia, the Caucasus, and some other parts of the area. The next wave took place in the early 1240s, when, as I mentioned, the Mongol commander Baichu forced the Anatolian Seljuks to become client states. And then again, there's a gap. And the next wave took place in 1256, when the brother of the current Great Khan, the brother's name was Hulagu, launched a massive invasion in the Middle East, and the goal of that invasion was to conquer everything that was left, and it wasn't much. All that's left by this stage is the Byzantine Empire, or parts of it, the Crusader states, the Ayubid Empire and the Mamluks, but as you rightly say, also the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. So the Mongols begin their advance into Persia, and they conquer a few remaining strongholds, which are controlled by the Nizaris, who are a branch of Shia Islam, and they're commonly referred to today by their nickname, which is the Assassins. And then 2 years after that, the Mongols reach Baghdad. Now, as you mentioned, there was a time, centuries before, where the Abbasid Caliph ruled the entirety of the Middle East and much of North Africa as well. But by the time we get to the 13th century, the Abbasid Caliph controls very little territory, little more than Baghdad and some surrounding towns. But spiritually,
it's interesting, and it's a might be a silly comparison, but they would kind of foreshadow what would happen to Constantinople later on, because it's kind of similar story to how Constantinople would fall, and how little the Abbasid Caliphate had left when they kind of fell in the 13th century as well. And so I did feel like there's kind of a little similar comparison. It's kind of a foreshadowing of what would happen to Constantinople in 1453 as well, and how little power they had left by the end of their lifetime.
Interesting comparison. Yeah, I can see that in a similar way, both territories have all their exterior lands taken, so it's just the capital city left. So, yeah. But the Abbasid Caliph has enormous spiritual authority. He's the head of Sunni Islam, and therefore the symbolic importance of the Abbasid Caliph is enormous, and Baghdad itself is an absolutely vast city by medieval standards. The Mongols arrive in 1258, they lay siege, and there then results one of the most brutal and bloody sieges of this era, as Baghdad's population is massacred and the Abbasid Caliph himself is executed.
And of course, one of the most devastating parts for me with the siege is the fall of the House of Wisdom, where so much science and scientific research were destroyed by the Mongol invasion. And just imagine what you could have today had all this scientific research survived from the House of Wisdom. And we should also add that it's because of the Abbasid Caliphate that we talk on this podcast today, because with the invention of a lot of what we have today with technology is thanks to the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, and a lot of it is thanks to the Abbasid Caliphate's contribution to science.
Yeah, so there are many centers of learning in Baghdad that are destroyed in this process, or even if they're not destroyed, the people who are there and their works are destroyed. But there is an interesting afternote to that, which is that the Mongols themselves are interested in science. And so both at the siege of Baghdad and elsewhere, the Mongols look to spare any scientists or leading intellectuals who they come across, and they send all these intellectuals and scientists to a place called Moraga. and they found there a research institution. Now, what the Mongols want from this research institution isn't particularly practical. They want the scientists to work out how to extend the life of the Mongol leaders, how to ensure their victory, and how to read the stars so as to predict the future. And of course, the scientists can't do any of these things. But they still conduct research. And it's interesting to note that there were serious scientific advances made at Moraga, including, for example, advances in spherical trigonometry, which still have played their role in developing knowledge today. So it's an interesting afternote to this. But that's an afternote within a broader context of a great deal of destruction in Baghdad itself.
Another thing that might be surprising to some is, of course, as the Mongols would advance and integrate their societies into their empires, they would also adapt their societies into their empires. And religion, of course, would also play a part. So let's talk a little bit about how Islam as well would play a major part, at least in I'm not. It's kind of. I'm not sure if western part of the empire is the right direction, or the eastern part of the empire is the right term here. But let's talk about at least in what I'm not going to refer to it as because it's not the right term yet. But I'm going to refer to it to the Ilkhanate because though it's not a term for quite some time yet. But I'm going to. So next, I want to talk a little bit about how Islam would play a part in the Mongol and how they would adapt the Islamic religion as well. And of course, there would be Christians who tried to make them adopt Christianity as well, though they would fail, but at least they tried. But Islam, what was Islam the most attractive religion for the Mongol leaders of this area?
Okay, so when the Mongols expanded into China or the Middle East or what's maybe Russia or Eastern Europe, it's a quite well observed process that the Mongols in those areas began to adopt the culture and religion of the people they had conquered. And so in China, the Mongols began to take on many of the aspects and practices and insignia of a Chinese emperor. In the Middle East, again, the Mongols adopted many of the ideas and concepts and sort of court rituals of Persian rulers throughout history. And so the Mongols begin to take on the cultural look of the people they're conquering. Now, in terms of religion, there's an interesting dimension to this, which is that when we look at, watch movies or read books about the conquest of one people by another, the book will typically show how a group of young, energetic people who have been conquered, they band together, they find allies, they build an army, and they resist their invaders, and the book ends with peace and happiness and celebration. In my experience, that hardly ever happens, from what I've read in this period at least. The Mongols were virtually unstoppable in their early years. No one successfully resisted them by rebellion, not in the early period at least. In my experience, rebellion tends to work when it's plausible, not simply when the persecution is at its greatest. So what you've got is a very different reaction to Mongol invasion. You have people doing the exact opposite. They try and make themselves useful. They send agents from their communities, bureaucrats, traders, religious leaders to the Mongols, trying to make themselves useful. And the reason they're doing that is because they know that if they can make themselves useful, perhaps they can steer Mongol policy or steer Mongol thinking in a particular area. And everyone's trying it. People from Christian communities in the Middle East, Muslim communities, there's a strong presence of Buddhists in the Mongol court. Every society the Mongols have conquered is sending people to the Mongol court, trying to be helpful. And the reason they want to be helpful is because they want to acquire influence. Perhaps they can win a more advantageous position for their own community. Perhaps they can convince the Mongols to invade there and not there. Or even better, perhaps they can convince the Mongols to convert to their own religion, because if the Mongols convert to their own religion, you've suddenly got a very advantageous position. And everyone's trying it. But In the Middle East, some Mongols do convert to Christianity, but in the long term, the Mongols convert to Islam. And there's a lot of different theories about how this came about. Some people argue it's because the Mongol leaders converted first, and then the Mongol the rank and file converted afterwards. Others suggest it was the other way around. I see it as more of a mixed process, but there are various possibilities. One possibility is that when the Mongols conquered the Middle East, this is a theory it's not my theory, but I think it's got a lot of mileage to it, is that when the Mongols conquered the Middle East, they felt a strong sense of affinity and connection to the Turkish rulers in the Middle East who had themselves invaded the Middle East out of Central Asia a couple of centuries previously. It was very natural for the Mongols to work with them because they had a great deal in common. And the Turkish peoples of the Middle East had already converted to Islam. And so that link may have played its part. Another possible factor is that many stories talk about Mongol leaders being inspired by Sufi leaders. So perhaps that's something. That's another factor why the Mongols converted.
If I may comment to your other theory, aren't the Turkish tribe and the Mongols maybe not closely, but a little bit related as well. From what I understand, that they are kind of because they had Turkish ancestry in some way as well.
Yeah, I think, and that's it. I think that sense of affinity between the Mongols and the Turks may have played its role in the Mongols' conversion. Another factor may have been simply that the Mongols realised it was easier to rule people if they were more familiar, if they weren't quite so different, as it were, to the people that they were ruling. So there is an element of that too. But these are the sorts of factors that people discuss when talking about why the Mongols converted to Islam.
Of course, we must talk most about Islamic states right now, until now, but I want to talk a little bit about because we mentioned the Fourth Crusade early in this episode, and I want to talk about how this would divide the Eastern Roman Empire into several mini Eastern Roman Empire, like the Nicaea and Trebizond and other mini principalities as well. So I want to talk a little bit about, especially Trebizond, as you talked a little bit about in your book as well, because my understanding, of course, they didn't have much to go on. They weren't large. They weren't that large, and they had no means of defending themselves against the Mongols. So they submitted quite easily to the Mongols when they arrived. So what were the relation with Trebizond and the Mongol Empire like when they submitted so easily to the Mongols?
Okay, so in 1204, the armies of the Fourth Crusade conquered the city of Constantinople. And there's various reasons for that. Initially they were supporting a Byzantine claimant to the throne. The Byzantine claimant to the throne had offered them a huge amount of money to do that, but then didn't pay, so the Crusaders took the city instead. What followed that was the collapse of the Byzantine Empire as a single state. And so what's left of the Byzantine Empire, part of it was conquered by the Crusaders, but other parts became sort of smaller Byzantine successor states. There was a powerful one in the western tip of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. There's another one in what today would be sort of northern Greece and the west coast of Greece and the Balkans, and another one called Trebizond in the northern coast of Anatolia. And soon after their conquest by the Crusaders, these Byzantine territories then have to work out how they're going to respond to the Mongol invasions. Now, the Byzantine state of Trebizond realizes very early it's not in a position to resist the Mongols, and so it submits to the Mongols before it's been attacked. But the more powerful Byzantine state, which is also further away, at Nicaea, it plays a very interesting game with the Mongols because the Mongols have two demands in diplomacy. You've got two choices. Choice one, you can choose to submit to the Mongol Empire, acknowledge that the Mongols have a right to rule the entire world, and therefore you. And the second option is to face invasion. But the Byzantines were determined to find a third option. So what they did was not to say yes or no to the Mongols. What they did instead was to play a waiting game. So the Mongols sent them envoys, and the Byzantines, on one occasion, the Mongol envoys to the Mongols died in suspicious circumstances, and the Byzantines then wrote to the Mongols and said, your envoys have died, you'll need to send us some more envoys. But of course, that whole process took many years, so the Byzantines gained a few more years. And then in 1257, the Mongols sent more envoys. And on this occasion, the Byzantines met the envoys at the border and then took the Mongols by the most complicated route through their tiny territory to give the Mongols the impression that their empire was huge. And that then strengthened their negotiating position. But ultimately in 1260, as Hulagu's army, after its conquest of Baghdad, advanced further west, the Byzantines felt no alternative but to come to terms with the Mongols. And so for a time at least, it seems, it's not quite clear if they became a client state, but they certainly reached some kind of a settlement with the Mongols from about 1260.
Another thing, of course, is that happens about this time is the recreation of the Khwarezmian Empire as well. So let's talk about the creation of what I would call the Neo-Khwarezmian Empire. So that's how were they able to re-establish the Khwarezmian after the Mongols destroyed them and made it cease to exist. So how did it? What were the? How did that happen?
Sure. So. And yeah, so by the way, it's Mongols, not mongrels. Just to...
That's fair. That's fair. That's fair.
So I'll answer that question again. So yeah, when the Mongols first invaded the Middle East, they attacked the Khwarezmian Empire, and the Khwarezmian Empire encompassed Persia, sort of modern-day Iran, but also several sort of surrounding areas as well. And the Mongols invaded the Khwarezmian Empire and conquered much of its eastern and northeastern territory between about 1218 and 1223. Then the Mongols paused for a while, and in 1230 a new wave of Mongol invasions reached the area. And that Mongol invasion was then met by a ruler called Jalal al-Din. And Jalal al-Din had tried to resist the Mongols when they invaded initially. And he took refuge in India and then took ship to the western districts of his empire soon afterwards, where he took control of the defense of the empire. But Jalal al-Din, he tried to reconstitute his empire, and he tried to sort of build up a big enough power block to resist the Mongols' next invasion, but he was so brutal in his actions and conquests that he alienated every other territory in the area, and every other territory in the area allied against him. And within a few months of their defeat of Jalal al-Din, the Mongols' next invasion came in and met with virtually no resistance because Jalal al-Din had just been defeated by all the other regional powers. So this is sort of an earlier section of the history of the Mongol invasions of the Middle East, but it's also part of the reason why the Mongols conquered large areas of the Khwarezmian Empire so easily.
Let's talk about the creation of the Ilkhanate as well, because as you know, the Mongols they would later split up their empire. You have Kublai Khan and his empire in China. You have the Crimeans later on, and you have all these different empires that were split up. So let's talk a little bit about splitting up of the Mongol Empire. And of course, the Ilkhanate will be, as is known, is of course the main focus in the Middle Eastern world and the main Khanate that the people pay tribute to in that world. So let's focus on talk a little bit about the split of the Mongols, and then of course about how the role the Ilkhanate would play in the Middle Eastern world.
Sure. So while all of this is going on, while all these waves of invasion are breaking over the Middle East, and there are other invasions in other areas as well, the Mongol Empire has to be ruled. And what the Mongol great Khans do is to hand out large areas of their empire as what are called ulu. And ulu are areas of jurisdiction. They're areas that individual branches of the Mongol ruling imperial dynasty, they have some jurisdiction, over. They're still formal parts of the Mongol Empire. They still have Mongol governors. But nonetheless, the sons of Chinggis Khan, who form the various families of the Mongol Empire, they have different parts of the empire as their ulu. But here's the problem. They don't always treat each other as allies or friends. They recognize they're all part of a bigger Mongol Empire. But rivalries begin to develop between the various different branches of the Mongol Empire. So, in the 1250s, when Hulagu, as I mentioned, the brother of the great Khan Monka, advances into the Middle East, he arouses the anger of another branch of the Mongol Empire, which is the Jochid Empire. And their main area of Ulu, or their Ulu, is in Russia and Eastern Europe. And they feel that they have rights over the Middle East. And so when Hulagu conquers it, they want Hulagu to acknowledge their overlordship, their hegemony, their control over the area. But Hulagu refuses, and so there are various sort of incidents. When Hulagu conquers Baghdad, the Jochid dynasty, and their ruler is called Burqa, he writes to Hulagu and says, I want some of the wealth conquered from Baghdad. I control the Middle East, so you should give me some of the wealth. And Hulagu refuses. And then Hulagu also executes several of his commanders that have links to this rival Jochid imperial family. And this is a big problem because increasingly these two branches of the Mongol Empire, they start off as rivalries, but those rivalries become enemies in time, until by the 1260s, they're beginning to look at each other as formal enemies. And this is important because as soon as Hulagu has conquered Baghdad, he begins to move west into Syria. And it seems very likely that the entirety of the Middle East will fall to his enormous army. At the same time, the Jochid dynasty to the north of the Caucasus is preparing its own massive campaign. And its massive campaign is to conquer Western Europe. And crucially, neither of those campaigns really takes place. And the reason for that is that these two Mongol dynasties, rather than fighting against their enemies, they turn against each other instead. And so you have a Mongol civil war, which then prevents further expansion. So those rivalries become very important.
Now let's talk about a bit the power the Ilkhanate has in this period as well over the Middle Eastern state, because they are still the overlord in a sense, even if they're split up their gigantic empire. They still have, for quite some time until the end of, I believe, the 13th century, they still have some power over their Middle Eastern states. So let's talk about the relationship that the Ilkhanate has with some of these Islamic states and, of course, some of the Christian states as well.
Yeah. So the Ilkhanate is Hulagu's empire. Basically, he's conquered it. He's conquered it himself. He is refusing the claims of the other Mongol imperial dynasty to that area, and so really the Middle East becomes a separate Mongol empire. It still sees itself as part of the bigger Mongol Empire, but really Hulagu and his successors begin to act like independent rulers. And as Hulagu advances west, after his conquest of Baghdad, he destroys the Ayubid Empire. This is the end of Saladin's empire. And all that's really left facing him after this point is the Crusader states, which are tiny and in no position to resist him, and the Mamluk Empire in Egypt. So, Hulagu, or one of his commanders, sends envoys to Mamluk Egypt, demanding the Mamluks submit to the Mongols. And the Mamluks make their position very, very clear. They execute one of the Mongol envoys and shave the beards from the other two. And as you've quite rightly said, the Mongols take this extremely seriously. So from this point on, there can only be war between Mamluk Egypt and the Mongols. But the Mamluks do something rather surprising. They don't wait to be attacked. They advance beyond Egypt and advance out across the Sinai Desert, proactively seeking to attack the Mongols. And as the Mamluks advance, they offer the Crusader states an alliance against the Mongols. The Crusader states refuse because they aren't convinced the Mamluks are going to win, but they do offer some food and horses to the Mamluks because they want to make sure that they remain in favour with whoever wins. The Mamluks then march into Mongol territory and fight a battle against the Mongols at a place called Ain Jalut. But things work out in the Mamluks' favour, because shortly before Ain Jalut, Hulagu's brother, the great Khan Monka, died. And so Hulagu withdrew from Syria with 90% of his army, leaving only a garrison in Syria. And it's that garrison that the Mamluks meet. And so the Mamluks meet a much, much smaller army than the vast Mongol imperial army that had been in the region. And crucially, the Mamluks win at the Battle of Ain Jalut. And this isn't common. The Mongols don't normally suffer defeat, even if it's just one of their garrisons rather than their entire army. But the point is that this then marks the beginning of a massive war between the Mongols and the Mamluks. The Mongols swear revenge against the Mamluks, but they're so caught up in their rivalries with the Jochid dynasty to the north, it takes 20 years for the Mongols to return with a large army to try and attack the Mamluks. And the Mamluks use that 20-year period to do two things. The first thing is to build up their army and their economics to be strong enough to fight the Mongols, but also they virtually destroy the Crusader states. And so by the time we get to the Mongols' new offensive in 1280-81, only the tiniest areas are left under the control of the Crusaders, or Franks, as they were known. And so the end of the Crusader states, which the final end was in 1291, but much of their territory was lost in this crucial period, the end of the Crusader states is not some enormous battle and confrontation. It's just the Mamluks destroying them while they're preparing their army to face their much more serious opponent, the Mongols.
So let's talk about the Seljuks as well at this point in time, because what are they doing while all this is happening?
Sorry, what's who doing what?
The Seljuks. What are the Seljuks doing while all this is happening as well? What are their state of power at this time?
Okay, yeah, great question. So after the Seljuk Sultanate was forced to become a client state in 1243, for many years the Seljuks carried on ruling, but they had to pay a large tribute every year to the Mongol Empire. But the Seljuk state had a problem, which was that they only had limited control over the Seljuk Sultanate. Much of the control across many of the areas, particularly on the sort of their western side, many of these areas were ruled by quasi-independent Turkmen nomads. So Turkmen nomads effectively governed much of the Seljuk Sultanate. And as the Seljuk Sultan's power went down, these Turkmen nomads became more and more powerful and began to rebelling against the Mongols, taking power for themselves. And so the Seljuk Sultanate begins to collapse and is replaced by much smaller territories, which become known as beyliks. And these beyliks are really, really important, because one of those beyliks is called the Ottoman beylik. And so what we're looking at here is the origins of the Ottoman Empire. Originally a Turkmen group, possibly driven to the region by the Mongols during their advance. The Ottomans found this beylik for themselves and expand from there. This is still a very early stage in the Ottomans' history, and they've got a long way to go before they become the massive empire of the 15th and 16th century. But in their roots, at least, this is the beginnings of the Ottoman Empire is in the chaos of the collapsing Seljuk Sultanate under Mongol overlordship.
So were the Mongols very much the cause of the rise of the Ottomans?
In many ways. And in some ways, the Mongols are also the cause of the rise of the Mamluks too, because large numbers of the enslaved people who the Ayubids purchased to become Mamluk soldiers were purchased very cheaply from the Mongols. So the reason the Ayubids Mamluk regiments expanded was because they could buy enslaved people in large numbers from the Mongols, and then the Mamluks took power to create the Mamluk Empire. So it's interesting yeah, absolutely.
So what caused the decline in Ilkhan's power? Because, like you said, they were quite powerful, and people still paid tribute to the Ilkhans early on in their creation. So what caused the downfall of the Ilkhanate in the Eastern world?
Sure. So once the Ilkhanate had conquered the area, and it was very powerful for a while, but it suffered huge losses of troops fighting against its Mongol rivals. It also lost several big battles against the Mamluks. And this is a problem because the Mongol Empire, part of the reason it's able to conquer so much territory is because people are afraid. Because the Mongols conquer one country, and the Mongols conquer another country, and another country, and another country, until it becomes virtually inevitable the Mongols will conquer everywhere, and everyone's terrified. But what happens if people stop being terrified? Because once you get to sort of 1260 onwards, the Mongols stop conquering territory, and they start to focus their attention on fighting against Mongol rivals or attacking the Mamluks, who are quite good at defending their borders. So the Mongol advance stops. And suddenly this is where people do start to think, well, maybe we can rebel against the Mongols. So rebellion's one problem. The Mongols' rivalries with other Mongol powers is a problem. And then once you get to sort of the early 14th century, you've got a series of dynastic problems where the Mongol rulers, the Mongol Khans, many of them don't have legitimate heirs, so people they can obviously hand power onto. And so the Mongol center in the Ilkhanate begins to diminish and crumble, and various Mongol regional governors start to act independently themselves. So the Mongol Empire fragments. Eventually, at the end of the 14th century, so we're going quite a long way ahead now, there is a new wave of Mongol invasions by the Emir Timur, often referred to in Western Europe as Tamburlaine, but that lies somewhere in the future.
Well, I think the answer is pretty much already. Sorry, I think the question pretty much already answered itself. But what would you say is the legacy of the century that we've spoken about today?
There's a lot of legacies. I mean, the one we've talked about most is political change. Ayubid Empire, Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, Crusader states, Anatolian Seljuk Sultanate, the Zengid Empire. So many territories in the Middle East were destroyed by the Mongols, or at the very least forced into subjugation. The new empires of the 14th century, the Ottomans, the Mamluks, these empires are reasonably new. So political change is one thing, but there's a lot more to it than that. During the process that we've been talking about during the 13th century, new technologies from Mongol-ruled China reached the Mediterranean. Gunpowder is one. The magnetic compass is another. But also in the process of resisting the Mongols, new technologies and ideas are being devised. Religions move. And so just as the Mongols themselves invade the region, for a time there's a Buddhist presence in the Middle East, although that's destroyed fairly swiftly once the Mongols convert to Islam. Many Islamic religious leaders see opportunities as being part of the broader Mongol Empire to send religious leaders into Central Asia to try and convert peoples in that area. So religious change is another major dimension to all of this. Another one is knowledge. because the Mongols didn't seek to conquer the world to find out about it, or that wasn't their main intention, but nonetheless, the creation of a huge Mongol empire enabled a lot of information to be shared. And so, for example, to give a couple of stories, when the Mamluks in Egypt sent ambassadors to the Mongols of the Jochid dynasty in Crimea, the Mongols said to them, "Oh, you're from Egypt. We've heard about Egypt. Isn't that the place with the big river?" The Mamluks said, "Well, yes, the River Nile. That's in Egypt." And the Mongols said, "Yes, we've heard about the River Nile. Isn't there a huge bone that crosses the river like a bridge?" And the Mamluks were very polite, and they said they haven't seen the bone. But what we're looking at here is various different societies expanding into areas they've never experienced before. And they're testing their myths against the reality that they're meeting. And so suddenly, societies that didn't know about strange and faraway places like the British Isles or Norway, suddenly now they know about them. And for example, Norway becomes very important to the Mongols because it's known that Norway is where you can get the best birds of prey anywhere, gerfalcons. So the Mongols actually send envoys specifically to Norway because they want to acquire gerfalcons for the Great Khan. So suddenly people's knowledge of the world expands. And this is also true for other areas. In the Muslim world, suddenly their knowledge of Central Asia dramatically improves because they're now part of a Mongol empire.
And at the very end, you mentioned the travelers such as Ibn Battuta traveling throughout the Eastern world, and of course Ibn Khaldun as well. So the adjacent knowledge is of course broadened by the travels of these men, and of course they aren't the only one, but of course they are just what someone you mentioned at the end of the book as well, but get to see the known world.
Absolutely. And it's the same for Western Europe too. Missionaries and envoys go to the Mongols and suddenly they discover that the myths that they thought were out there weren't out there. And so many people go looking for Prester John and don't find him because he didn't exist.
I think we're going to round it up there. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you about this topic today. So, of course, before you go, do you have anything else you want to promote? Anything new you were working on that you may want to share with us? Or where can people find your book, The Mongol Storm? Or if they have a question to you, or where are you available on social media if they have further questions about Mongol history or the topic of the book that on Middle East or any other topic they might want to ask about if they are more curious about this.
Sure. So yeah, I'm on social media. I've got a YouTube channel. There's a few videos you could watch if you like there. I'm also on X or Twitter or whatever we're calling it now. I'm on Bluesky and Threads as well. And I've got a small Instagram account, but I don't use it very much, but you're very welcome to connect with me as well. So there's lots of ways to get in touch. And yes, please do ask me questions if you've got any questions about this period.
Thank you so much for coming. It's been great fun. And of course, this has been Well.H12. We are available on social media under Instagrams, under Well.H12, Twitter/X, on Bluesky, under Well.H12 as well. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, give us five stars if you like this episode, or you can give us one. It's a free world, at least for now, at the present time of this recording. Or you can write a review on Apple Podcasts. That would help us out a lot. If you're on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. Also, leave a comment. You can leave a comment on Spotify too, what you think about this episode. If you have questions, leave us a comment on Spotify or YouTube as well. Check out some other episodes we made. I'm sure you're going to find something that you liked. This has been That H12. My name is Anna, and I'll see you next time.